The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, the verses that I want to look at this morning are what I call the life side of the 23rd Psalm. It seems like so many sermons that I've heard and probably even preached myself on the 23rd Psalm have to do with going through the valley of the shadow of death and how God gets us through those situations. But life is not all going through the valley of the shadow of death. And within these last 2 weeks, a lot of you remember our grandson Ethan. He went with two of his buddies up to the Adirondacks to go do some cave exploring. There was a space, and he had a camcorder on his forehead and a light, so you could see what, and there was a space just a little bit higher than a foot high they had to crawl through inside this cave. It was very big inside. And one of his buddies, these are three Christian young men. One of them, Jack, in fact, his father is the pastor of one of the churches over in Perry, New York. He got in there and he was scared, and I don't know what they had for a light. They had some kind of flare or something, which didn't work out too good either because it filled the whole thing with smoke. But he got out his Bible and was reading the 23rd Psalm on the valley of the shadow of death part. And you're like, God, get us out of this cave. But everything went well. Nobody got hurt. But we can sometimes dwell so much on the problems of life and these valleys that we can almost become paranoid. There's even a devotional, a wonderful devotional called Streams in the Desert. But again, we're not always in a desert. And so I want us to look at these particular two verses that say, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And in these verses, it mentions four things that show up in red there: a table, enemies, oil, and a cup. And those are the four things we're going to be looking at this morning. And so the table isn't just talking about a piece of furniture, but it's symbolic of what is on it. A table doesn't exist for itself. It exists for what's on it. And what is on it is that God prepares a feast for us. And my main thought about this is that I want to leave you with about this table is that God cares for you. And it's not just what we can do for him. I've worked for people in the ministry and big organizational kind of situations. where I and others sometimes were left with a feeling, though they were good people, they accomplished great things, but we sort of felt like our value was with that leader was only what we could do to further their vision, to further their goals. And when we were no longer involved in that way, we really weren't all that much importance. And we might even have that idea about God, that we're only important to Him as far as obeying Him and doing things. That's not the way it is. You are important to God because you are one of His kids. Somebody said if God had a refrigerator, He'd have your picture on it. I doubt if He needs a refrigerator, but that's the way we treat our friends and especially our grandchildren. And if you have a lot of missionary friends, they send you these magnetic things you can put on your refrigerator too. We hardly have a blank spot on our refrigerator. And this idea was a little hard for me to understand because of my relationship with my father, who was a really good man in many ways. And you know, when you're a kid growing up, you don't have enough maturity to make excuses for your parents as to why they're the way they are. But looking back, I really marvel that my dad was as normal as he was, having been a first sergeant, master sergeant in the infantry, 4 years in World War II, in hand-to-hand combat. And when World War II was over, there were no debriefings. It was, the war's over, guys, go home. There was no processing out. And these soldiers came home still holding all this stuff inside. Now we know a little bit more about how to take care of them, but there's still veterans from Vietnam and other wars. There are suicides every day from soldiers. And I know my dad he only talked about where he was, places. Algiers, North Africa, Sicily invasion, Naples, Italy invasion, France, Belgium, Germany. I have a handwritten letter he wrote, says, from a foxhole in southern France, saying goodbye to my mother and me. Thank God he did come home. But he didn't think he was going to. He said, I have one more job to do tomorrow, it'll probably be the last. I'm not looking for sympathy. It just doesn't seem right not to say goodbye. And so I didn't see my father till I was 4 years old when he came. I think he came back once in between, but I was too young to remember that. So I didn't know who he was when he came home. But he had all of this inside. He would only talk about what he went through with other veterans because they were the only ones who understood. So he was very locked up. It was very hard for him to relate to me, though he was very good. I know that if I'd asked him, Dad, do you love me? His response would have been, well, of course, see all of the things that I buy you. But we never did anything together. So I can say this because I have no negative feelings toward him at all. And thank the Lord, after I got saved, my parents got saved, and the Lord healed him, and we did wind up having the relationship that we didn't have when I was a kid. But I grew up with that concept toward God, that everything between me and God was just out of obligation. And I think there are a lot of Christians like that, for whatever reason. It's just obligation, just to obey. Yes, God loves me. I know because Jesus went to the cross and died for me. So I know He loves me. But there's not that relationship that you enjoy on a daily basis. In fact, in our seance study Friday night, somebody said, one of the things they missed in the church they grew up in, they understood a lot of things about God, but not relationship. And even when we discover it, we spend the rest of our life really growing in that. Like Michael pointed out in our adult Sunday school class, which is a wonderful study on the Ascension Psalms. But another thing in this, with this provision, it's not enough just to survive. God doesn't give us enough just to get by. That's not his nature. It's abundance. And that's why Jesus said in John 10:10, I am come that they might have life and they may have it more abundantly. Everything God does is with abundance. It's never enough just to get by. I'll have to confess, I've never watched one of those Survivor programs. In the first place, they seem so phony. But I don't want to offend anyone that really likes those, but I'm not one of them. So, with this idea that walking with God and his provision is not just for survival, we want to get away from, how you doing, brother? Well, under the circumstances. God doesn't want us under the circumstances. Are there circumstances? Absolutely, there always are. But God wants us on top of the circumstances. He wants us, if I can use Peter as just an illustration, walking on water. Now we fail, just like Peter did. I love Peter. I identified with all of his foibles. But even when he failed, and he looked at the storm, got his eyes off of Jesus, and started sinking, Jesus didn't say, you knucklehead, how long do I have to keep putting up with you? It says he immediately reached out and grabbed his hand and lifted him. That's what he does with us. Even when we fail, God is bigger than our failures. And so he wants us to experience what it means to be seated with him in heavenly places, looking down on our circumstances, not looking up at them. Now that may happen temporarily when we find ourselves in a bigger situation than we've ever been before in our life, but God doesn't want us to stay there. He wants us to rise above it. And that thing, I think a lot of us are old enough and walking with the Lord to have experience. We can think back to some situation, some problem that just seemed like a monster. And yet when we look back at it now, having grown in the Lord, the thing looks like a mosquito. I mean, it's the same thing. It's a matter of perspective. So God is more interested in wanting us to experience victory over our circumstances than removing the circumstance. He can do that. And then when the circumstance no longer serves any purpose, he usually does free us from it. But we don't want to continue with any more of this under the circumstances. He wants to give us a buoyancy that causes us to rise above and change our perspective. Now, this table we're talking about is not different from the communion table that we celebrate monthly. In the scriptures, eating together isn't just to satisfy our hunger, just to have food, but it's about fellowship and fellowship with him. Usually in the scriptures, when it talks about eating together, it's not about the food, it's about fellowship. In Revelation 3:20, if any man hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. This is in the section of Revelation chapter 3. I call it the chapter of doors. It talks about several doors, that he can open a door that no man can close, and he can close doors that no man can open, but this door he doesn't open. It's up to us to open this door. He's knocking, but he's not going to force the door open. We have to open that door to fellowship, and that might mean rearranging some of our priorities in life. We can't be opening the door to everything at the same time. But when we open the door to him, he comes in spiritually, and we begin to have an awareness of him that we didn't have before. And we have to keep renewing that. It's not just a one-time thing. This is his table. It's not our table. It's his table. Just like the communion table is his table. And I saw an interview with the founder of Starbucks one time. And I know that not all Starbucks are exactly laid out the same, but at least in the beginning, a lot of them had small round tables you could sit at. And he said, I'm no psychologist, but it just seemed to me that if a person comes in alone and doesn't have a friend to have to eat or have their coffee with, they can sit at a little round table and not feel so alone. Whereas if they sat down at a square table, it leaves them with a feeling that there ought to be a friend here with me and I'm sitting here all alone. But God's, actually, I picked the wrong picture for a table because that one is round. But God's table don't have to be round because he is sitting there with us. We're not alone when we are enjoying this table that he has provided for us. So a few years ago, Connie's one of her sisters was visiting us, and Kathy has quite a prophetic edge on her. She's not always going around, "Thus saith the Lord," but a lot of times God will just give her a word for someone that she doesn't necessarily know what it means. Well, 2 mornings in a row while visiting us, she woke up with a word for me. And she said, "I don't know what this means, and if it had just happened once, I would have ignored it. But 2 mornings in a row, I woke up with this word in my mind that was for you." And she said that God is going to spread a table before you. I thought, well, it doesn't sound like a bad thing, whatever it means, but I had no idea what that meant. She didn't either, so she says, "Well, I'll just leave it with you and see if God brings clarity." And I was really at a point in my life, even those a few years ago, that I felt that God was probably done with me in ministry. Well, I think, we've probably done everything God wants us to. I'm getting older, and I probably run my cycle, and so it's time to be put out to pasture, and God's gotten out of me whatever he wanted to. And I used to go to South America every year, do pastor seminars, and I thought, well, it's probably over. And then all of a sudden, I started getting these invitations that, not because I necessarily thought I was the most qualified, but the invitations came. Shortly after that, to be the speaker at the first National Pastors Conference in Paraguay. And down there, it's different. For instance, when Elam Fellowship has their annual Pastors Conference, they usually have about 3 different speakers. High-profile, well-known speakers, but probably only speak once, maybe twice. I'd wind up speaking 8 times in the same time. I was the only speaker. They didn't bring in anyone else. So talk about a stretching experience. And then in one of those, I probably referred to this, the mayor of that city asked the organizer, would your speaker talk to us, politicians and commercial leaders? And making a long story short, I wound up doing that. And I asked who's there. The governor and a lieutenant governor of that state were there. And the people they invited. When the governor invites you, you go if you're in politics. And then even, I think this was about 2012, I was asked to be the speaker at the first international missions conference, promoting missions, getting South American churches involved in World War. So on the plane, I thought, this is my last trip down. The pastor we raised up there, they got 4 kids. One has raised up 4 churches. One was the president of the Open Bible denomination for Paraguay. I'm probably just getting in their way. And it was like from the time I got off the plane, doors were opening. You've got to come back more often, 2 to 3 months at a time. That's what I was doing before I took this pastor. So obviously I haven't been able to go for 2 and 3 months at a time. But, I couldn't have arranged this on my own. And I usually feel like there's probably somebody else that could be doing this better. But God spread a table in front of me of opportunity, and I love what I do when I'm down there. If I can encourage one pastor indirectly, I'm encouraging a whole congregation whom I might not even get to see. But by strengthening that pastor and encouraging him, that can be encouraging that congregation. So it's been fun. But when that word came, I had no idea what it meant to spread a table before me. But it also says, in the presence of my enemies. So sometimes in the background, there's some enemies. There's forces that are working against you. Well, they weren't in the illustrations that I just gave you, but when God sent us to live in Paraguay, and I think you've heard me say this before, we did not want to go to Paraguay. We wanted to go back to Argentina. And there were situations in the government in Paraguay. It was under a dictatorship. And there were situations in the Christian work that were in a mess. I didn't want to have to really get involved in. But God did all of these extraordinary things to confirm this is His will, removing every excuse I had to think, well, maybe we misunderstood. No, I knew we had to go. But when we got down there, the government was not issuing any more visas, residency visas, for religious workers, even Catholic priests. It was like, no more religious workers. So I said, well, Lord, this is your idea. You're going to have to work out this visa situation and do some kind of miracle. So we went through the regular process through immigration to try to get this. The agent even got me an appointment in the office of the Minister of Interior of the country. And when I got in there, he was very sarcastic, kicked me out of the office. We don't need you here. God, what's going on? We obeyed you. We know we're supposed to be here, but we have to live here legally. You never know how God's going to do it. And these 2 Christian Argentine brothers and a partner of theirs who had come up to help in the work, but they were businessmen, had started a furniture factory. And so one of them heard about our situation, and came to me and he said, "Didn't you used to work as a quality control supervisor in some company in America?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, here's a letter. We have just officially made you the Director of Quality Control for Guzman Logunyuk Furniture Factory. But there are two conditions. Number one, we're not going to pay you. And number one, we're not going to pay you. Number two, we're not allowing you to work. Now go get your visa and start planting churches." So for 7 years, we lived in Paraguay on a legal visa as with me as the Director of Quality Control for Guzman Logunyuk Furniture Factory. Not my problem, they didn't want my help. How can you figure out how God's going to do it? And so, in spite of any opposition, if you are moving in God's will, there's nothing the enemy can do to prevent it. Someone said to me, "Well, maybe Pastor Ben's having trouble getting his passport because it's not God's will for him to go." Well, that's a possibility, but you don't know until you've done everything you can to try to get it. And then if that door doesn't open, you conclude it wasn't God's will, but you don't give up. You keep going, or you get a word from God where God says, "Don't do it." Then you don't. But until then, you don't know until you've exhausted every possibility. And then anoints my head with oil. So we're not going to worry about the enemies, but anoints my head with oil. This is like the woman who poured spikenard over the Lord because the host of the meal didn't do it to Jesus. This wasn't the first time in history that someone poured spikenard or precious oil over a guest. This was a common practice to do over a very important special guest in your house. And the person who arranged this didn't do it to Jesus, so this woman did it to Jesus. But what it's saying here, this is what the Lord wants to do for you. The host in that occasion didn't do it for Jesus, but Jesus wants to pour this precious oil on you. Coming back to how special you are to the Lord as an individual. What will happen when the Lord does this? We begin to carry the presence of the Lord in our lives. And the people we come in contact with can sense there's something different about us, something good, something about God. And I can remember when our kids were teenagers and some of their friends would come into the house and they'd say, "Wow, there's a different atmosphere in your house." They didn't know what it was, but they said, "There's peace." And some of them were even from Christian families. But they said, there's tension in our house. But when I walk in here, there's peace. These things aren't fairy tales. They're real. And in Acts 4:13, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. When you spend time with Jesus, you start carrying the fragrance of the oil that he pours out upon you. And then the last thing is my cup overflows. Not just full, but overflowing. Another example from our grandson Ethan when he was little. We would have each of our grandchildren, the ones that lived nearby, to our house like for a weekend. And then Connie would have them help set the table at mealtime and like fill the water glasses. Well, with Ethan, everything always had to be a joke. So he would fill the water glasses up to the meniscus, you know, where the water is actually just a little bit higher than the glass, and you can't touch it. without making a mess. So, you know, everybody that was sat at the table had to go to get the extra water off, and he was just delighted. And then, you know, on some sinks they have that sprayer. He'd put rubber bands around the handle and have it pointing at where Connie would go in the laundry room and turn on the faucet. That was life with Ethan. But that's what he would do. When I think of an overflowing cup, I think of Ethan helping to set the table. He's 21 now, but a lot hasn't changed. My cup overflows. You know what this is talking about is that God is extravagant. He's not only abundant in the way he does things, he's extravagant. And I'll end with this, my next to the last illustration. I had to fly to Detroit years ago to minister, and of course I had round-trip tickets. Afterwards, I wish I had driven. But the airline called me even before I left and said, we can get you to Detroit, but we won't have that flight coming back that you have reservations for. I said, well, it can be a different time. They said, no, you don't understand. We will have no flights with this airline from Detroit back to Rochester. But we'll make up for it. We'll fly you first class on everything, but on the way back, we'll have to fly you around to some different places, but we'll get you home. So on that trip back, they flew me from Detroit to Atlanta. And so I thought, well, there's this book I've been wanting to read, so I took it on the trip. So I get to Atlanta, but then of course I have to wait for the next plane, and that one was to go to Boston. And so I got on this plane to Boston in first class, and this young woman got on, and the seat next to me was empty, and she said, anyone sitting here? I said, not as far as I can tell. And but I thought that's strange, because in first class, people don't normally just grab a first class seat. So a lot of passengers aren't all that friendly. They don't. This one wanted to talk, and extremely friendly. And so she was talking about. She was from Florida, and I said, well, you don't have a Florida accent. She said, well, actually, English is my second language. I couldn't tell her. So what's your first language? She said, Spanish. I'm from Dominican Republic. I said, oh. And so I said, what do you do? She said, well, I'm a airline stewardess. That's why I'm just grabbing this flight to work on the next flight out of Boston. And so what do you do? And I said, I'm a pastor. And she goes, so I'm a Christian, but I haven't been in church for a long time. And, but she still loved the Lord, but she just wasn't walking. And we're getting toward Boston, and I said, would you mind if I prayed with you? And she said, I would love for you to pray with me. So I switched to Spanish and prayed with her in Spanish. She burst into tears. She says, not only does God lead me to sit next to a pastor, but one who speaks my heart language. And so we get to Boston, and she got off. I think the same plane was coming on to Rochester, so I just stayed there. And then she fought her way back onto the plane against all the people getting off to come back and thank me again. And then I thought, God is extravagant. In one sense, I felt like I'd wasted a whole day. But God arranged this for his kid who wasn't walking with him, but knew him. and loved him, and he loved her. But all of this just to bless her used up I mean, if I had driven, I would have been back in Rochester by then. But I thought, it was worth it. This is a reflection of God's heart, the kind of thing. I have more stories than that, but that one to me was very graphic, because God, why did you have me waste this? This day wasn't wasted. Just to be able to pray with that young woman. And so the table is to the feast what the cup is to its contents. It's what's in it, what God puts in it for you and me, a cup of blessing that's overflowing. So everything in Psalm 23 goes back to verse 1. Who is your shepherd? You see, all of these blessings are not automatic for every human. They're only automatic for those who have made Jesus their shepherd. He's not everybody's shepherd. And he's not your shepherd until you become his sheep and you surrender to him and let him become your shepherd. And so I don't know all of you, but the question we need to ask each of ourselves is, who is our shepherd? For some people, they're their own shepherd. They're not going to benefit from this. Or someone else is their shepherd. A pastor can't be your shepherd in the spiritual sense. Or something else. Remember that all the Psalms end with, and the end of the longest Psalm is, after all the wonderful things David said, he says, but I'm still prone to wander. All of us still have this. We're like sheep. We're prone to wander, even when he is our shepherd. So, be sure this morning, before you leave here, that you just express to the Lord that you surrender to him. If you have any doubts as to whether or not you ever had, and say, I surrender to you. I confess I'm a sinner, but you didn't come to condemn me, you came to save sinners. And so I surrender to you, and I accept your forgiveness, and I make you my shepherd. I know that Janet Ortiz is with someone today that they're counseling up in Rochester, I think, to a couple that want to get married, but they're trying to counsel them for more than just that, but for their spiritual life. And the bride-to-be said, well, I do want to make God part of my life. I'm sorry, that's not what God wants, to be a part of our life, somewhere over here. He wants to be in the center of our life. And that's why a lot of Christians live very confusing lives, because they have God as a part of their life and not in the center. So, like sheep, we need sheepdogs. And you know that God has sheepdogs to keep us in line. Do you know the name of God's sheepdogs? I'll show you a picture of it. They're there, right there. You know their names? Goodness and mercy. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Enjoy the life side of Psalm 23.